Good evening, and thank you for joining us here at the Nightly News Channel. My name is Jack Kenny, and I'll be your host. Tonight, the Nightly News Channel will be airing a special feature program where we will examine the use of scapegoating in historical events and COVID-19. I will attempt to provide explanation for similarities and differences in scapegoating, and will also explain how past events can help us understand the COVID-19 crisis. Let's dive right in. Scapegoating generally describes when someone blames a group of people for causing a problem, and that group ends up taking the fall for it. Scapegoating has been around for many years, going all the way back to the Black Death in the 14th century. During this time, anti-Semitic scapegoating attempts were common. At the time, it was easy for the public to blame a certain group. After all, someone had to pay. The most marginalized groups often suffered, and in this case, it was the Jewish people. Pandemics often bring about panic because of how fast the virus spreads. When people don't know how to stop something or don't know much about something, in this case the Black Death, they do the next best option, which is to find someone to blame. In the mid-14th century, when anti-Semitism was prominent, many rumors circulated that Jews were poisoning the water wells, which led to infection spreading. Many massacres of Jewish people took place. Jewish communities were destroyed. This scapegoating that occurred was a direct result of many years of pre-built anxiety towards Jews. The Black Death was an opportunity to take decades of anger out on Jews. It was a simple explanation to a much more complicated situation, therefore making it easier to understand for people. In fact, scapegoating reveals much about humanity itself and the deep, underlying preconditions that rise above the surface when panic and fear is evident. Although not as extreme, society today is not that much different from 6 centuries ago. Scapegoating has occurred as a result of the COVID-19 outbreak. For example, there have been many cases in Montreal recently where certain groups have been targeted during the COVID-19 crisis. It just so happens that in many of these cases, Jews have been targeted. On April 2nd, police were called to a synagogue in Outremont in Montreal over reports that a religious ceremony was taking place, despite the lockdown imposed by the Quebec government. When the police arrived, no one was found in the synagogue. The Jewish community has explained that no one was in the synagogue and that the synagogue was following government order. According to the report, the gathering was likely a lineup for a nearby grocery store. Elaine Pickard, a member of the Council of Hasidic Jews of Quebec, had this to say about the incident. Quote, "But people, especially in Outremont, had a tendency to associate Jews with the disease, to the point that they denounce anything at all. So we ask them, and especially the police, to be careful. You have to stop stigmatizing us. We don't want to be scapegoats." End quote. In other instances, citizens have called the police because they've seen lights on inside synagogues. After police responded, this turned out to be just custodians performing cleaning tasks. This is not much different than the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Because anxieties are heightened, people tend to look for a simple solution. If we look at the United States, President Donald Trump's use of the phrase Chinese virus during one of his press conferences can be considered scapegoating, which carries along with it negative implications. The World Health Organization has previously warned against naming viruses after geographical locations, as it can have negative racial consequences. The phrase Chinese virus somewhat implies that Trump is attempting to blame Chinese people or China for the virus, instead of recognizing his administration's own mistakes. The negative repercussions of Trump's scapegoating are clear. On March 17th, shortly after Trump's use of the phrase Chinese virus, a White House staffer called the virus, quote, "Kung flu," to an Asian American reporter's face. In late March, an FBI report predicted that hate crimes against Asian people will rise during the COVID-19 crisis. The use of scapegoating by a public figure has only intensified racial issues in the Asian American community. In this case, Trump is actually fueling hate towards Asian Americans. Trump gives people an easy way to blame someone for the crisis. History can help us understand why scapegoating is occurring in the COVID-19 crisis. Scapegoats are common in crisis. In 1995, after a car bomb blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City, the media was quick to draw conclusions. Experts said that this was definitely the work of Middle Eastern terrorists. It was later discovered that the car bombing was actually orchestrated by homegrown terrorists. In the Great Fire of London in 1666, Robert Hubert identifies himself as the one who started the fire. A mound of evidence comes out to say that he didn't start the fire. Courts knew that he didn't start the fire. However, he was still sentenced because a scapegoat was needed. So, what is common about these examples? Firstly, preconditions and anxieties existed. In the Oklahoma City bombing, citizens were already on edge from previous terrorist attacks. People believed that it was a Middle Eastern anger with the U.S. that caused the attack. This played into exactly what people feared. In the Great Fire of London, the Black Death was still on many people's minds, adding a level of anxiety. Additionally, the British did not like the French at the time, making Hubert the perfect scapegoat. Secondly, it was easy to accept it because it provides a simple explanation to a complicated situation. People were quick to accept the bombers were Middle Eastern because it made sense and it was better than it being homegrown terrorists. Accepting that Hubert started the fire was easier than accepting that the city was simply a fire trap and that the city officials failed to implement measures to stop the fire. So, in the case of targeting Jews in Montreal, people do so because they feel they need someone to blame, and blaming the Jews is the easiest way. It makes sense. Moreover, targeting Asian Americans is easy to do because of the way Trump portrays it. What's most disturbing is that over 6 centuries have passed since the Black Death, and yet these incidences of scapegoating still occur. We have way more knowledge than people did in the 14th century, and scapegoats are still being chosen. There is clearly no correlation between Jews and COVID-19. It shows a lack of an ability to learn. One main difference between scapegoating many years ago versus now is that less substantial preconditions exist in 2020. Preconditions in the 14th century, such as anxiety around crop failure, disease, or war, are not really the same preconditions faced today in 2020 in North America. While I recognize preconditions still exist, they play less of a role in our decision to choose a scapegoat. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight to this special program. Have a great night and stay safe.